On the 29th of April 1916, after 140 days, the besieged British and Indian garrison at Kut in modern-day Iraq surrendered to the Turks. It was the biggest surrender of British forces since Yorktown 130 years beforehand. But why were the British there? How did the siege end in defeat? And what happened to the garrison afterwards? The siege of Kut took place during the First World War in Turkish Ottoman-controlled Mesopotamia, modern-day Iraq. The Ottomans entered the war on the German side, and a joint British-Indian army landed at Basra in Mesopotamia and advanced on Baghdad. Checked by Turkish forces just before the city, they fell back to the town of Kut, where they were besieged. Reduced to eating horse meat and eating weeds, suffering from starvation, scurvy and dysentery, they held out for 140 days. Attempts to break through to relieve them ended in failure, and over 23,000 casualties. The siege of Kut also saw the very first attempt to airdrop supplies to a besieged garrison. But in the end, having lost 1,700 men either killed or to disease, British commander General Townshend surrendered his 9,000 men. That was 3,000 more than the British surrendered at Yorktown. Those prisoners now embarked on a horrific death march in which 1,700 or 70% of the British troops died or were never heard of again, with at least 1,300 Indians suffering the same fate. This is the story of Britain's disaster in the desert. In August 1914, at the outbreak of the First World War, the British landed a small force from the Indian Army at Abadan in Persia to protect her, and in particular the Royal Navy's, oil interests. However, when the Ottomans formally entered the war on the 30th of October, those oil fields were once more vulnerable to enemy forces in neighbouring Turkish-governed Mesopotamia. The British decided that the best way to protect those oil interests was to clear the Turks out of the south of the province. The ensuing military expedition came under the direction of the India Office and the British Indian Army, rather than the War Office in London. And therein lay its future problems. Most used to fighting tribes on the northwest frontier, the Indian Expeditionary Force was woefully unprepared for the campaign. Not that it seemed to matter at this particular moment, because the landing successfully overran the Turkish fort at Fao before capturing Basra on the 22nd of November. By Christmas they'd advanced 50 miles inland to Connaught at the confluence of the Tigris and Euphrates rivers. With the reasonably easy success, a spirit of complacent optimism abounded within the British establishment in India. The Viceroy of India, Lord Hardinge, was keen to advance north and capture the ancient city of Baghdad, and his new military commander in Mesopotamia, General Sir John Nixon, agreed. In October 1915, and with the Turks' attention focused in Egypt, the Caucasus and Gallipoli, Nixon ordered General Charles Townshend to advance up the Tigris with the 6th Indian Poona Division. The 54-year-old Townshend had risen to prominence when he had successfully held out in the northwest frontier region of India during the siege of Chitral in 1895. His first objective was to capture the town of Kut before, if possible, to continue up the river to Baghdad itself. The 6th Division was a mixed force of Indian and British troops. Ever since the Indian Mutiny, the British had never 100% trusted their Indian troops, and consequently, each Indian division had somewhere in the region of 20 to 25% of its strength made up from contingents from the regular British Army. In this case, Townshend's British troops were the 2nd Dorsets, the 2nd Norfolks, and the 1st Ox and Bucks Light Infantry. Meanwhile, the rest, and majority of the division, were made up of 9 Indian infantry regiments. Now, I've produced a list of them in the description, but they included the 117th Mahrattas, the 22nd Punjabis, and the 7th Rajputs. Also present were about 1,000 cavalry, plus contingents of the Royal Field Artillery, the Indian Artillery Brigade, sappers, pioneers. In total, Townshend's division consisted of about 12,000 fighting men. Having easily taken Kut, Townshend advanced all the way to Ctesiphon, about 30 miles south of Baghdad. And there he found the Turkish or Ottoman army waiting for him. And it was a very different army to the one that had been swatted aside at Basra the previous year. These Turks were German trained and consisted of veterans from their recent success at Gallipoli. Moreover, they were well entrenched and outnumbered the British by nearly 2 to 1. The Battle of Ctesiphon on the 23rd of November 1915 was hard fought. After 6 hours, the Turkish front line was finally in British hands, but Townshend's force could not make any further progress. By 5 p.m, he ordered his troops to break off action and retire for the night, having lost 4,600 men killed and wounded, over a quarter of his command. His officer ranks had been shattered. 130 of the 371 British officers had been killed or wounded, and half of the 255 Indian officers likewise. His medical posts were hopelessly overwhelmed. They simply crammed as many wounded soldiers as possible onto 2 steamers, which were ordered to sail all the way back to Basra, which they finally arrived at on the 17th of December, 23 days after the battle. With little shelter from the sun or rain, let alone medical support, and dysentery rife, people later said that they could smell the 2 boats long before they could see them at Basra. And when medical teams went aboard, they had difficulty climbing over the dead to reach the living. Maggots crawled over wound dressings and open wounds. It was like something from the Crimean War, and quite frankly was nothing short of a scandal in 1915. Meanwhile, what was happening back up the river? With his small force having suffered over a 25% casualty rate, Townshend calculated that there was no way he could seize, let alone hold, Baghdad, and he ordered his men to retire back down the river to Kut to await reinforcements. As fate would have it, having lost 9,500 of his own men killed or wounded, the Ottoman commander had also ordered his troops to withdraw. So he was somewhat surprised to hear from his scouts that the British and Indian army were now in retreat, and despite his own losses, he now turned his forces around and gave chase. Conducting a fighting retreat, Townshend and his men arrived at Kut on the 3rd of December 1915, having covered the last 44 miles in 36 hours. Kut was a featureless town in a loop on the Tigris River. Most of the houses were made from mud, and while some were 2-storey, the highest building was the tiny mosque. The streets had no drainage, and when the rains came, became a stinking, slippery bog. Around 6,000 Arabs lived in the town. As an aside, the Arabs in Mesopotamia had not greeted the British army as liberators, but with a sullen resentment of exchanging one colonial master for another. Townshend now informed Nixon that he intended to stand and fight. And with his force of 7,400 infantry, which included a contingent of West Kents who had been sent up to join him, and a further 3,500 non-combatants and camp followers, Townshend was confident that he could hold the Turks at bay until relieved by fresh troops due to be arriving in Basra. On the 7th of December, the Turks launched their first infantry attack on the town. Advancing to within 400 yards of their lines, the British and Indian defenders were amazed to see the Turks fling themselves to the ground and start digging trenches at a speed that was almost superhuman. They were to dig 31 miles of trenches around Kut before the siege ended. 3 days later, the 10th of December, the Turks launched 4 ferocious frontal attacks on Kut. The British defenders fired 61,000 rounds of ammunition as the attackers were beaten off with heavy casualties. And then on Christmas Eve, the 103rd Mahrattas, the 119th Infantry and the Oxfords, who were holding a fort on the right of the British line in the town, came under fire. The Turkish attackers managed to actually break into the fort, but were driven back in hand-to-hand fighting that lasted nearly an hour. The last of the attacks was beaten off in the early hours of Christmas Day. Of the 30 men from the Oxfordshire Regiment in the fort, only 7 emerged unscathed. Meanwhile, the Mahrattas had lost 103 men killed and wounded, and the 119th Infantry another 63. Turkish losses were estimated at 2,000, with the Turkish officer recording 900 dead. There was now a lull in the fighting, and the garrison managed to enjoy some seasonal festivities, including a Christmas dinner. And as the year closed, the British and Indian troops looked forward to their imminent relief. On the 10th of December, General Sir Fenton Aylmer had arrived from India to command a relief force spearheaded by the 7th Indian Division, which included British regulars from the Seaforth Highlanders, the Black Watch and the Leicestershires, as well as regiments like the 53rd Punjabis and the Jats from India. But his relief plan was not going well. The so-called port of Basra was in complete chaos, with absolutely no port management in place. The Indian 7th Division, who would spearhead that relief, had arrived from seeing action on the Western Front, only to find that their transport wagons, medical ambulances and other equipment like wire cutters, signal guns and periscopic rifles were somewhere on a ship between Marseille in France and Basra. Making the best of a bad job, General Aylmer moved his relief column forward on the 5th of January. During the rest of the month, his relief expedition suffered nearly 8,000 casualties as they tried to break through, but to no avail. With no relief of Kut in sight, General Nixon's head rolled, and he was replaced by General Sir Percy Lake. Meanwhile, life in Kut was starting to get more desperate. Constant artillery bombardments and sniper activity was combined with falling food supplies and horrific weather. Now, it's easy to think of a war in the Middle East of being fought in hot, arid desert a la Lawrence of Arabia. But the truth in Mesopotamia is that the winters can be bitterly cold, and the regular rainfall turned the trenches on both sides into something similar to the Western Front. The water-sodden and then freezing trenches resulted in frostbite and gangrene of both fingers and toes. By Christmas, 1,140 sick and wounded were crowded into the hospital. And apart from that obvious strain on medical resources and beds, the doctors were short-staffed as 3 of their number had been killed in the siege and a further 2 died from disease. By the end of January, with food supplies dwindling, Townshend was reduced to killing the garrison's horses for meat, a move that was met by horror by the majority of his Indian troops on religious grounds. Consequently, scurvy now broke out amongst those non-horse-eating troops, and by mid-February 150 cases had been reported. Maybe not surprising that these privations, along with the siege conditions themselves and no sign of relief, lowered morale amongst many Indian troops. And added to this, Turkish leaflets appeared in the town denouncing British rule in India and asking why the Muslim troops in the 6th Division were fighting for non-believers. Throughout the siege, there was a trickle of Indian soldiers deserting or wounding themselves with self-inflicted injuries. As the weather warmed with the approach of spring, British and Indian defenders had to cope with sandflies whose sting felt like a hot needle, lice infestations and swarms of flies. What with the Tigris River overflowing and flooding the trenches and large parts of the town, and a plague of green frogs, it was like something out of the Old Testament. And that was without the putrid stink of hundreds of dead Turkish bodies in no man's land. Finally, on the 8th of March, General Aylmer, suitably reinforced, launched his next long-awaited assault. But once more, after nearly 20 hours of fighting, he failed to dislodge the Turks, whilst losing nearly 3,500 men. A further attempt to break through the Turkish lines at Sansiat ended in failure, and once more heavy losses, 3,000. It was now time for Aylmer's head to roll, and he was replaced as commander of the relief expedition by Major General George Gorringe. The situation in Kut was now getting desperate. Townshend reduced the rations of his garrison to 5 ounces of barley per man per day, plus additional 1 pound of horse meat for those who would eat it. In these dire circumstances, many of his Indian troops finally decided to eat the horse meat, but for many it was too little too late. The non-meat-eating Indian troops were dying at a rate of 15 a day. Scurvy was still the most common complaint, but the hospital was also struggling with cases of dysentery, malaria, pneumonia, diarrhoea, beriberi, especially among British troops, bronchitis, jaundice and gastroenteritis. It was now that General Lake organised the first ever drop of supplies to a besieged garrison from the air. Unlike Kohima and Imphal and the Berlin blockade, however, the results had little effect. Inaccurate drops, poor weather and interception by German fighters hampered this early effort at air supply. The 9 British planes flew 140 missions and dropped 19,000 pounds of food, but it was nowhere near enough. In a final attempt to get supplies through to the town, a steamer, renamed HMS Jula, had attempted to break through the blockade on the river, but it got stranded and became a sitting duck for the Turkish gunners. Both the captain and the first officer were to be awarded posthumous Victoria Crosses. General Townshend now requested that General Lake enter into negotiations with the Turkish commander Halil Pasha. Lake suggested that as the gallant defender of Kut, Townshend might be able to receive better terms if he negotiated directly, which may have been so, but then it also meant that history would not record Lake as the man who surrendered Kut, would it? He did, however, send 2 intelligence officers to assist in the negotiations. Aubrey Herbert, a member of Parliament who had been offered the crown of Albania a few years beforehand, and T.E. Lawrence, who would later become famous as Lawrence of Arabia. But their assistance came to nothing. Townshend's appeal for a parole, in other words an honourable withdrawal whilst agreeing not to fight the Turks again in the war, was refused by Halil Pasha. It was complete surrender or nothing. And so, having destroyed all his guns and rifles, Townshend surrendered his garrison on the 29th of April 1916. It was the biggest surrender in the British Army's history since Yorktown, over 130 years beforehand. During the 140-day siege of Kut, the British Indian Army had lost just over 1,700 men, of whom 700 had died of starvation or disease. Of the 1,450 sick and wounded at Kut, just over 1,000 were exchanged for Turkish prisoners and sent downstream. Later, with the aid of the US consul, a further 350 were repatriated from Baghdad. On the 6th of May, the defeated garrison, many without boots, began their long march into captivity far to the north in Anatolia, well over 1,000 kilometres away. Marching up to 24 kilometres a day with little water or shade and subjected to frequent beatings by their guards, they were even stoned by locals as they marched through the town of Tikrit. Over 4,000 British and Indian POWs died on this death march or in the camps. From the British rank and file, 1,700 or 70% died or were never heard of again. Of the Indians, about 1,300 were known to have died, although numbers of survivors cannot be exact, as even as late as 1924, ex-POWs were turning up in their villages in India. Townshend did not suffer the same deprivations as his men. The Turks removed him to Constantinople, modern-day Istanbul, where he was kept prisoner in relative comfort. He died back in Britain in 1924. During the 4 months of the siege, 23,000 men of the relief force had either been killed or wounded trying to break through. That's twice as many men as were in the besieged garrison that they were trying to rescue. Whatever way you cut it, for the British, the Indians and the Allied cause, the siege of Kut had been a disaster in the desert. But of course, for the Turks, on the heels of Gallipoli, it was yet another victory. History always has at least 2 perspectives, doesn't it? Mesopotamia is one of those forgotten theatres of World War I, rather like my videos about the Battle of Beersheba in Palestine and the war in German East Africa. As always, I'm grateful for all of your support, whether it's in likes, super thanks, or even becoming a patron. There's details in the description below. Thanks for joining me today. Keep well, and I'll see you again very soon.